in many cases, if it's a retrofit, a lot of times the existing mortgage holder will be excited about having energy upgrades that will cut the operational cost of the building and add value to the building. So that kind of gives a sense of, I've got several assessment bonds that I'm working on and CPACE bonds right now in multiple different municipalities. Is there any questions about assessment bonds or CPACE bonds at this point? I just wanted to kind of give you a quick overview of CPACE. I can come back if there's an interest. I can come back and give more detail on CPACE later, or perhaps you've already had a presentation on CPACE from Shauna or from somebody else.
Joe, we've got a couple of questions on the chat line from
Sure.
Mitch Zundell.
Oh, thank you.
The first one is, for a typical housing development, what is the ratio or the times the amount of bond the city should have to lower the risk to the city?
So in Utah, one of the things that's not on this slide that I've had on other slides, Utah requires a maximum amount of leverage for the assessment of 3 times. So a loan to value. So if the assessed, let's say the finished lots are going to be worth, I'll use a Wasatch Front number here. Let's say they're going to be worth $100,000. The Utah law maxes out the ability on assessment bonds to be $33,000. So no more than 1/3 of the value of the finished lots can be used in bonds. So does that?
And Mitch, you're unmuted. So if you want to speak out,
sure.
Go ahead.
No, that was good. That was perfect. That's what I was looking for. I have a couple other questions on the chat line that I've asked.
Yeah, let me take a look at here. The costs for the city to put together this, the interesting thing is all the costs can come out of the bonds themselves. So they're not cheap, and an assessment bond for anything less than about $1.5 million doesn't make any sense with the startup costs. You got to pay, there's several sets of attorneys and municipal financial advisors that need to get paid out of the cost of the bonds. So you're talking about probably on a base, you're probably talking about the smallest bond. You're probably going to be $30,000-$40,000 in legal costs to set it up to begin with. So the city doesn't put that money out; it comes out of the bond proceeds. So it's not a need there. Now, Mitch, you also asked what happens if the assessments don't get paid off. The bond holders, the buyers of the bonds, get the property. I mean, in the end, that's what happens. It's it's a loan that's guaranteed by the property, and if the loan's not paid, then the property gets repossessed. It gets foreclosed. So depending on how there was a new law that went in place last year. The foreclosure can be a fairly quick foreclosure. If it's still the developer that owns it, it can be a very quick foreclosure. If it's a resident that owns it, it may not be very quick. It may need to go through a full judicial foreclosure. But that generally doesn't happen because on the assessments, let's kind of walk through that just for a second. Let's say that there's a house that has a $20,000 assessment in place and the house is worth $250,000. So there's a mortgage on it for maybe $200,000 and there's a $20,000 assessment ahead of it. Should the homeowner choose to not pay the assessment, the entity that's managing the assessments will send a note to the mortgage holder letting them know that the assessment wasn't paid. The nice thing about assessments is that it doesn't accelerate. Is all that needs to happen on that one property is just whatever the back payment for that year is needs to be paid, and so there's no acceleration on it. It's not not a thing where it's you know, a Snidely Whiplash kind of thing where somebody's trying to take houses. It's just a situation trying to bring people current. So that's, generally speaking, the mortgage holder will bring an assessment current because they've got a vested interest in making sure that they don't get foreclosed out, because assessments go ahead of the mortgage holder. John, you asked, can an assessment bond be done for commercial development? Absolutely. It certainly can be done for a commercial development, and there's CPACE, I'm working on a project right now that has an assessment bond and a CPACE bond for commercial development. And so the CPACE bond is going to be a $10 million bond, and the assessment will be about $2.2 million. So it is possible to do. No, they don't. The ratios are exactly the same for commercial and housing developments. Now, a CPACE bond doesn't have that same rule of 1/3 coverage. A CPACE can be more than 1/3, but most CPACE bond buyers don't like to do it for less. They don't want to see 25% loan to value is the most that I'm seeing on CPACE bond buyers. So it's kind of market driven based on what they will offer. Are there any other questions? Now, before I go here, one of the other things that I'm working with, I've got some groups that I'm working with that do capital leases, and maybe it makes sense for me to come back later and talk about capital leases, but they're a way to finance public infrastructure without a public vote, and the current effective rates on those are somewhere between 3.5%, maybe 4.5%, depending on what that is. We can talk about capital leases at another time. I do have a source that can do small projects down to $400,000 on a capital lease, or even potentially a straight loan if there's revenue. So water and sewer projects, they could potentially go down to as small as $400,000. Now, one thing, I've been talking with Jake about kind of putting together a database of projects around the state so that there's kind of a list of projects that are prioritized. I'd like to start maybe gathering that information. Either Jake said that he'd be happy to, let's see here. Thank you, Mitch. So if a developer uses the assessment bond for 1/3 of the value, where do they get the other 2/3 generally? Generally, that has to come through other financing mechanisms. They just flat out have to have the money. They go out and get a loan. I've talked with some banks that actually are very comfortable with the idea of lending with an assessment area in place. Even though it's ahead of them, it's looked at as property tax because it has a property tax level lien. So in some cases, some banks are not comfortable with that, and other banks like that, and they feel like it's cash into the deal because that money is sitting in an escrow account and rides with the land. And should something go wrong with the development, that money in that escrow account goes with the land, not with the developer. Is there any other questions? I'd be happy to take any questions. My email address is joe@utahp3. Happy to answer any questions directly. I'll probably be reaching out to a few of you and just asking about projects that you have that are $400,000 and up, and see if there's anything that I have that might be able to help put those projects, infrastructure projects in place in particular. Jake, is there anything for you?
No, thank you, Joe, very much. I mean, the more tools that we can have especially for infrastructure projects in rural Utah, the better. And so that's why I really appreciate your presentation today. Hopefully, like you said, if anybody is interested or has a thought on a project that they might want to look at, they can either contact you directly or contact me. I'd be more than happy to start that database of projects and that list. And make the connection to Joe so that we can get as many projects funded as possible. So, and I know Joe's reached out to CIB and some other individuals to kind of talk about different projects. So, thank you again, Joe, and good luck with your son coming home today.
Okay. Yeah, he's about 2 hours away from Salt Lake now, so we're pretty excited about that.
Well, that's great. Well, if there's no more questions, I appreciate everybody else joining us on this webinar. I think our next webinar isn't until August. I'd have to check on that, but I'll keep that in line. I will send out the PowerPoints for these presentations today. Unfortunately, I only recorded the last 10 minutes of this session, so that's my fault. I'm new to this. So, but I will send out the PowerPoints, and you'll have Kristen's and Joe's contact information to work with them directly if you like as well. So. Thank you all again, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.